Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Learning Launchpad, the Acadian podcast that explores all dimensions of transformative, lifelong learning in a modern digital world. I'm your host, Mark Anderson, and in this episode, you'll hear me giving a talk at the famous Bett Show in London earlier this year. And I talk about the importance of effective pedagogy in the design of online learning, and particularly making sure that technology itself doesn't become the driving force in learning design at the expense of our educational goals. So let me know what you think, and I'd love to know what strategies you use to keep good pedagogy front and centre in your technology-enhanced learning.
Please put your hands together for Mark Anderson, please. Thank you very much.
All right, hi everyone. My name is Mark Anderson, and I'm very excited to have an opportunity to talk to you briefly this afternoon about something that's very important to us in the higher education sector, the design and implementation of effective online learning. So we're moving forward a little bit in the learning journey from some of the talks that we've heard this morning around primary education and moving up into higher education and a little bit into the lifelong learning sector as well. So the area of online learning is something that's very important to us in higher education. Just a quick show of hands. Who's done an online course before? Quite a few of you. Who's done a MOOC? So obviously, as you'll know, MOOCs are very important to us in HE. Some say that they are almost transforming the landscape of higher education to a degree. So they're having a huge influence on the way that we think about learning and teaching, the way that we think about learning design and curriculum design, and how technology can help us to create those powerful and effective and ideally transformative learning experiences in online spaces. Now, this is very important to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, I work at a research-intensive institution that is very high-performing, and at the moment it's going through, or it's about to go through, a very intense and dramatic period of change in terms of the way that we do teaching and learning. And this is something that's happening in many different spaces across the higher education sector. Now, what this boils down to is essentially a move away from what has traditionally been a very content-driven approach to education, and moving more towards an active learning approach, a more student-centered, student-focused approach, really thinking about what we're asking learners to do and the way that we're engaging them in that learning process. And this is equally true for face-to-face learning, and especially true for the online learning space, which, for those of you that have done a MOOC, for example, just to use one example of online learning, you may have found that some of them are very content-driven still. So you'll be typically presented with a video and then perhaps given some opportunity to comment on it or engage in some discussion. So pedagogically, in that sense, some of them are still quite shallow and content-driven. Not all of them by any stretch of the imagination. They're getting better, and they're powerful because they're sparking conversations among university educators about what we're all about as educators in higher education and how do we go about designing that more effectively. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to me. The other reason, perhaps, is that I'm personally very passionate about lifelong learning, and particularly the power of technology to reach more people internationally, to reach people that perhaps aren't, for whatever reason, part of the formal education system, or perhaps don't have the same level of access to formal education. Lifelong learning and online learning in particular can be extremely powerful in that regard. So I have an independent education company called Acadian College, which deals specifically with this issue of developing powerful, transformative online learning experiences. So I'm very much involved in this key question of how do we design online learning to be pedagogically powerful. And for me, this all really boils down to this question: how do we embed the advantages of learning technology into our curriculum in pedagogically directed ways that enhance learning? And to my mind, there are three things there that I've highlighted that are the key elements of this question. So first of all, how do we embed the advantages? All right, so not the kind of standard approach in many situations is to kind of add technology on to a learning experience as a nice to have or something you feel you should have to fit with a learning and teaching strategy of your institution, perhaps. But how do you actually make it part of the curriculum from the earliest phases of design? How do you bake it into the curriculum so that the curriculum evolves around it rather than technology being added to it? The other key element here is how do we use technology in a way that is pedagogically directed? Okay, so rather than wanting to use technology for its own sake or because it's fancy, it's new, it's innovative, it's impressive, it's fast, it's convenient, putting the technology first because you want to have that technology, and then building the pedagogy around that. So technology is driving pedagogy in that scenario. We want to make sure that it's the pedagogy that is driving the learning design and not the technology. So pedagogically directed ways. And then thirdly, in this core question, ways that enhance learning. So not just make it more convenient, not just make it more accessible. They're all wonderful things, of course. But for me, enhancement means enabling something to happen, a learning experience, a learning gain, a learning advantage to happen that wouldn't necessarily happen as powerfully without the technology. Okay? So real enhancement in that sense. And this is a huge challenge. And this is a conversation that more people are starting to have in higher education context and in lifelong learning context, and I'm sure in many other education sectors as well. Now, one of the things I've come to believe, certainly in my experience with developing online learning, is that one approach to this is to take a very firmly design-centered approach to teaching and learning. So rather than starting from content, a syllabus, and then thinking about how I want to communicate that content to my learners, really thinking about it from a design perspective. So looking at that whole learning journey, that whole learning experience that we're asking learners to engage us on. Now, when you start having this conversation with some colleagues in higher education and lifelong learning, sometimes it feels a little bit uncomfortable. I'm often asked the question, well, why are you talking about learning design? I mean, can you really design learning? I think most of us would agree that you can't really design learning. But I do believe that you can design for learning. You can put a lot of effort into the way that you structure the learning experience to create the environment that is most likely to nurture powerful and transformative learning. So that's what I mean by learning design, really designing for learning, to give learning the best chance of happening. And one of the key reasons why this is important, I think, is that we can't just assume that learning will just happen. And this is, again, this is kind of the default scenario for many educators, particularly in higher education, perhaps, where things have been done a certain way for a very long time. And at my institution and at many other institutions around the country and around the world, indeed, we have world experts in their field. Some of them with incredible profiles. I'm working with Nobel Prize winners, CBE nominees, and so on. And to be able to approach them and say, look, we recognize and acknowledge your incredible expertise, but now we're here to talk to you about how you're going to become a better teacher. That can be really challenging. So there's an expectation still in place in some quarters that we need to move beyond, that learning will somehow just happen because you're in the presence of such incredible expertise. Now, don't get me wrong, the expertise is important and we wouldn't want to be without it. It's critical. We wouldn't have a higher education system without that expertise, and it's hard-won and extremely valuable. But we can't assume that just because it's there that learning is going to happen. So this design idea starts to become very important. Another reason why learning design is, I feel, very important is that there's no reason not to do it. We've got a lot of evidence for understanding how people learn most effectively. We know a lot about things that we can ask learners to do things we can ask them to engage in, and the way that we can present information and get them to work with that information to build knowledge through social constructivist activities, perhaps connectivism. There's a whole range of learning theories that are meaningful to us and which can inform our approach to learning design, that there's just no reason to ignore it. There's no reason just to carry on doing things the way we've been doing them for decades anymore, because that research has been done and that research is available. Now, when I talk to people, this starts to sound a little bit like teaching or designing learning as a type of engineering. And for some, as I said earlier, can feel a little bit uncomfortable at first. But this is because the idea of teaching as a form of engineering conjures up images of a very kind of like tight and constricted and inflexible, inorganic framework. And that's not what it's supposed to be at all. An example I often refer to is the design of an aircraft. You certainly wouldn't, if you wanted to take a flight and you were building an aircraft, you wouldn't just tack together a few bits of metal and a couple of engines and launch it off the edge of a cliff and hope that it will get you to your destination. Okay? So a lot of effort and investment and thought and collaboration goes into the design of that piece of engineering. That doesn't mean that you can't have incredible experiences, that you can't learn organically, that unexpected things can't happen within that design framework. But there's a case to be made for, at least to a certain degree, thinking about learning design as being a type of engineering, to whatever extent perhaps feels comfortable to us. I think, and I'm still working on this, as we all are, this is constantly a work in progress, but I feel, at the moment, fairly comfortable with 4 key elements that this idea of effective learning design for online learning boils down to. And I'll just share these with you now. First of all, and this is nothing new, learning design for online learning or face-to-face learning should be outcomes-based. Okay, and I'm sure this is very familiar. This goes right back to the idea of intended learning outcomes, okay, which we're familiar with in face-to-face learning design. So starting with the end in mind, like any good piece of engineering in a sense. So thinking about well-crafted intended learning outcomes, using those old active verbs, making sure that they're smart outcomes. Okay, so really thinking about what the intended outcomes are for a piece of learning. Let's not abandon that just because we're working with learning technology and we're thinking about online learning. Secondly, this idea of pedagogical alignment, or as John Biggs called it, constructive alignment. Everyone who hasn't heard of pedagogical alignment or constructive alignment? Who has heard of constructive alignment? I'm often curious. Okay, not so many people, a couple of people. So constructive alignment or pedagogical alignment is this idea that there should be alignment between your intended learning outcomes, what you're hoping learners will go away with at the end of a piece of learning, a learning experience, the ways that you're going to test that learning to see if it's happened, so that could be formal assessment, it could be informal ways of checking that learning's happened, and also everything in between. So all the teaching and learning activities that you get learners to engage with as they're on that path from intended outcome to assessment. Okay? So making sure they all relate to each other and they all make sense to each other. So if one of your intended learning outcomes is, for example, let's say by the end of this workshop you'll be able to discuss the structure of a cell. Okay? Just an example plucked out of the air. And then at the end of the learning experience, you're going to assess them on how they write about that in an essay. Okay, so they don't actually get a chance to discuss it. You don't ever see them discussing it or formulating a discussion around that. So there's misalignment between your intended learning outcome and what you're actually asking them to do. These are conversations that we're having more and more now in higher education with regards to face-to-face learning design, and I think they're particularly important when it comes to online learning, and there's no reason for us to abandon them just because we're thinking about technology-enhanced learning experiences. The third principle is to keep our attention from the very beginning of learning design on this issue of learning activities, keeping a very firm activity-focused perspective, really thinking about what we're actually asking learners to do, Because the default scenario, the default expectation, when we look at it, is that all we're ever really asking learners to do, 9 times out of 10, is to be passive recipients of information. Okay? Certainly in higher education, that's been the way that we've been doing it for a very long time. So we may think that we've created an engaging classroom or an engaging workshop, but at the end of the day, that's from our perspective as teacher. Okay? If you actually put yourself in the learner's seat and think about what they're actually experiencing through that learning engagement, we may be surprised when we realize actually they're just sitting there receiving information. Okay, so that's an important part of learning, but it's only one dimension of learning. So the alternative to that is to keep our attention focused on the activities, what we're actually asking them to do, and I'll come back to this point in a bit more detail in just a moment. And then the fourth principle, to make sure that when we're using learning technology, as I said earlier on, that it's our technology that is supporting the pedagogy and not the other way around. We're not wrapping pedagogy around technology because we want to use the technology. Okay, so pedagogy comes first, and then technology is brought in thoughtful and creative ways to support those pedagogical goals. And again, I'll come back to that a little bit later. So let's look a bit more closely then at this idea of activity-focused. Well, what do we mean by learning activities? I've found this model that I'll share with you now very helpful. It's certainly not the only model out there, and we owe this to Diana Laurillard from the Institute of Education, who identified sort of 6 domains of learning activity, or learning types, as they're sometimes called. Activities that learners engage in when they are learning, when we are learning. Okay? So almost every type of activity you can think of as part of a learning process could fall into one of these 6 broad categories. I suppose that's another way to describe what we're talking about. So the basic one is learning through acquisition, all right? That's what I was talking about earlier on, the passive, being a passive recipient of information. In higher education, that's been the way we've been doing it for a long time. We expect learners to receive our expertise, okay? It still has its place in any learning design, but it's just one of 6, as we'll see. Discussion, now we're starting to get a bit more juicy. We're starting to get a bit more learner involvement. We know that learning is deeper, it's of a different quality when learners can have conversations, when they can engage in dialogue and debate around issues. Inquiry, so getting learners to find things out for themselves, that's hugely powerful. So much more powerful than them just receiving information from us. If they can be involved in a process of exploration and discovery, that's something that we can design into our learning experiences, whether it's online or face-to-face, particularly online, because of the incredible potential of the internet, for example. It's extremely sad if we're not tapping into that and getting learners to be exploratory with that incredible resource. Learning through practice, another really important dimension of learning activity, getting them to perform actions as part of the learning process. Technology can help us with this in incredible ways through simulations and such like. Learning through production, getting them to make things, to produce something, to create artifacts that then can be analyzed and evaluated and discussed among peers and so on. And learning through collaboration, those really important skills, which in higher education we're really concerned about in terms of getting them ready for the workplace, so to speak. Those key team-building, collaborative skills that technology can afford, that can allow and facilitate in ways that are quite difficult to replicate in face-to-face scenarios. So in terms then of how we think about ensuring that technology is supporting pedagogy and not the other way around, I just want to very briefly, in a minute or so, show you one system that I've been using. And this has been heavily inspired by the guys at UCL who've developed a curriculum design tool called ABC Curriculum Design. And I adapted it specifically for use with designing online learning, so technology-enhanced learning. And this is basically still a paper-based workshop at the moment. But I'm hoping to be able to develop it into some sort of app so they can be done digitally. But the idea is that you have a huge storyboard, and this can be printed out on A0, for example, A0 size paper. And you have, literally like with a film storyboard, rows of activities which you design. You'll have your intended learning outcomes on this side, and you're constantly thinking about the types of learning, those 6 types of learning, and you work with these technology task cards, as I've called them, where you make sure that the learning type is the first thing you think about. Do I want learners to be discussing something or collaborating over something for this activity? What does that description actually look like, the task description? So really thinking about what the learner is experiencing, and only then do you think about the type of technology and the type of content that you need. And collaboratively, your design team will lay out this sequence of tasks for online learning design, and the end result is that you've got a good sense that technology is operating in the service of your pedagogy for online learning. And I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mark.